How many of you are familiar with the machinery, the EU machinery to deal with foreign policy? Can you raise your hand? More or less, a little bit? Right. So those of you that are familiar with that know how boring is going to be this class. I mean, let's face it. I managed to find one of the most boring topic ever. So why? Why did I do that? In a nutshell, I did it for two reasons. So yes, it's something extremely bureaucratic, extremely technical, at times very dry, but to begin with, studying foreign policies and the bureaucratic institutional apparatus to work on foreign policies in such a strange animal that is the European Union allow us to understand the limit of what we call its actorness. There are things many times, actually many years ago, Christopher Hill came up with this quite catchy phrase that there is a capability expectation gap, which means that we associate the European Union with a strong presence and a strong potential to act and make the difference at the global level, and yet it always lag a step behind what we're expecting from it. Understanding the structure, understanding the institutional lintel, right, that underpin the action of the European Union allow us to understand and foresee the limits of its ambition and scope of action. The second reason is because those limits stem from somewhere, and they basically stem from the disagreement among its members. After all, no matter for how sophisticated, as an example of international organization is, the European Union action in any field always depends from the attribution of competences in the framework of the treaties. So, if the member state didn't foresee a strong possibility to act in the framework of the treaties, well, surprise, surprise, we will see that the European Union will sort of struggle to make its steps into action or actorness into a given policy field. Now, with this sort of information in mind, today we are first of all trying to identify what is our field of action. In other terms, when we mean foreign policy, exactly what are we talking about? When we talk about diplomacy, what are we talking about? This also will help us sort of frame the limits of the problems that the European Union confront in being a coherent international actor. After that, we will glance and zoom into the European policy-making machinery and understand who are the actors that compose this puzzle, as Stefania was mentioning before. Eventually, we will see what are the problems that Lisbon fixed and what problems still remains to be fixed. And finally, we will arrive to a definition of the European Union's foreign policy as single in nature, dual in policy making, and multiple in nature. Right. But before we start, considering that the weather is fantastic, let's warm up a little bit. Right, now it's your go. Who is this guy? Oh. Yeah. I told you it's boring. What were you expecting? Do you think I was kidding? Who is this guy? The former European?
Commission.
Which role? President, right?
And former First Minister of Portugal.
And that's why you're doing that face. Now it's clear. And indeed, it was a quite controversial president of the European Commission. What do we know about him and his mandate at the European Commission?
He had 2 mandatories.
There we go. What else do we know?
He's the president of the
Goldman Sachs. Actually, right now, apparently he's working with Goldman Sachs, and there, I mean, we have another strands of controversy stemming from there. Yes? Yes. Yes. In this case, he had two. He was the first president of the European Commission after the beginning, after the Lisbon Treaty entered into force. So we can imagine in parallel two of the biggest challenge that the European Union has confronted since the end of the Cold War, meaning enlargement and the new institutional setting. In a way, the new institutional setting stemming from the Lisbon Treaty was a way to ensure that an enlarged union could take decisions. We will see that this issue of having and working with several member states will constantly come back into the picture. In the case of Barroso, Barroso was welcomed in a quite lukewarm way. He was considered one of the most distinctively unambitious, timid, shy commission, and not only that, but also to some leftists, even a quite neoconservative one. How about this guy? I need to. Yes, what's his name? Juncker. And what do we know about him? What do we know about this commission? It just started. It started in 2014. So, we can talk about records because much unfortunately, yet another challenge forced the European Union to sort of speed up in its action. Right, the financial crisis. So Juncker took and led alone the migration crisis, the refugee crisis. So Juncker needed to speed up his role and to try to work with all the other institutions for finding solution to it. But this is one of the the presidents of the European Union that didn't find the immediate endorsement of all the member states within the European Council. Have you heard about it? Cameron was immediately saying, no, it's too federalist. So it was a huge, huge block. So that started to anticipate yet another crisis that the European Union is confronting right now, Brexit, right? So it was too federalist, and Cameron immediately found the support of another great character of European politics, which is Viktor Orban, right? So we had a president of the European Commission that immediately before starting working met with the opposition of some member states. And also we had people like Habermas, that certainly certain of you know, that actually mentioned that not to elect this president, not to give this president the possibility to form his commission was a bullet at the heart of Europe. Let's see who is next. But you guys, you know all of these guys. Schulz, who is he? Former president of the European Parliament. 2 mandates, which is quite something. He's a very experienced member of the European Parliament, right? Even before serving in several commissions, right? Always working. Which party? There we go. Exactly. So heading the Socialists first, and then clearly from the SDP, being president for 2 mandates in a row. What do we know about him, apart from that? Anna, you know it.
Going up against Merkel now.
For the election that will take place in September 2017. So apparently right now, for what we know, it doesn't quite stand a chance, meaning that Merkel is far ahead in the polls, but yet he was unanimously named and incited by his own party to run against Merkel. And this guy, Antonio Tajani. What do we know about Antonio Tajani, apart from the fact that he loves Berlusconi? He's the new president, right, of the European Parliament. He was voted by a discrete majority of his own party, the PP, right? Not exactly, He was not exactly, he served actually also as commissioners of transport and industry before ferrying through the European Parliament, right? He's got a soft spot on culture. He's one of those who is pushing for the European Union to take actions in matters of cultural relations, right? Still there were just a little bit of complaints or background noise that he was not the most ambitious choice when it comes to the European Parliament. Let's see, who is this guy?
Maltese president.
There we go. And why do we have the Maltese Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, in this picture? Rotating.
He holds the presidency right now in Brussels.
There we go. This is yet another complication. Not only all these guys that comes from different institutions, and we are not over yet, but also the member states that constantly, right, and inherently take part to the activity of the Council of Ministers of the European Union, Council of Ministers or Council of the EU, right? We have what we called rotating presidencies, meaning that each 6 months, a president, a prime minister of a given member state hold the rotating presidency, right? And define the agenda for its own his or her own semester of the activity of the council. Clearly, this happened in a concerted way with other presidencies. We call them the trio, right, of the presidency, but also with the wider and longer term agenda of the institutions. There we go. Who are these two guys? Aha. There we go. Who is this guy? Where does he come from? Both former prime minister. The European Council, that for a long time was a sort of private room, right, for the member states to discuss all sorts of policy issues among very secretive, right, in a very secretive format, meaning if we find a solution informally, we will basically spur the European Union to act. More and more throughout the last 50 years, more or less, a little bit less, the European Council has become increasingly institutionalized. Before it was a sort of summit, right? And step by step it started to be an institution of the European Union. To the extent that the importance of its actions, as we are going to discuss in a second, think about the financial crisis right now, how active is the Council at its higher level of representation, right? To the extent that now its president is basically a fixed presidency. Instead of being chaired and directed, if you pass me the term, by the rotating presidency, that by antonomasia has got a short memory, we have now a permanent president that holds its position for 2.5 years. Final term. Slash vice presidents of the European Commission, because otherwise it was too easy, but yes. And their names are Katie Ashton, Mogherini. And do you know any juicy gossips about these two ladies or the process of their appointment?
That Caterina, she was very boring and she wasn't like a big person in the European policy because before the treaty we had another higher representative and he was Solana, I think.
Very good.
And he was a stronger person than she was. She wasn't very publicly well known.
Well, I mean, thanks first of all for this little lecture in diplomacy. She was very boring, I don't say poor Lady Ashton. But anyhow, I mean, you sort of touch a very soft spot. Certainly, she was not seen, considered that she was, yes, it's true. The High Representative before, Javier Solanas, was clearly a sort of giant, right? It reflected, on the one hand, the poverty of the role, right? Because the treaties, by the time the treaties of Amsterdam, didn't foresee an immense role for the High Representative. At the same time, the charisma of this political figure that was always formerly involved in NATO and so forth, his ability to negotiate behind the scenes gave him far more leverage than basically the leader of the treaty was expecting. On the other hand, now that the treaty was foreseeing with Lisbon a far bigger role, right, for the High Representative slash Vice President of the Commission, we are going to see what she does, as she, so far, as we can see, there, well, we had decisions that were not immediately characterized by high level of ambition. And this is what Caterina was meaning. Clearly, we were expecting to have a titan for this role, right? To have a role, a very visible politician. From this point of view, Catherine Ashton, but also Federica Mogherini, were, by the beginning of their mandate, not welcomed as the most senior politicians to cover this role, which clearly meant that the level of the ambition of the sort of compromise solution that the member states found among each other was not that high, right? Plus, we had first a Brit, which are not exactly well known to be the most pro-integrationist in the history of the European Union, and an Italian that, in a moment in which Russia is, let us say, mumbling and acting, right, in the eastern neighborhoods in ways that clearly makes, above all, the eastern country fearful, an Italian was seen as too lukewarm, right, to be the High Representative. So there was, in both cases of disappointments, right, a lot of doubt on the level of ambitions that these choices bore with them, okay? Why did we spend all this time to go through these slides? Why did we do this sort of intellectual gymnastics, in your opinion?
Because you wanted to show us that there is a big machinery, big bureaucracy in the European Union, and we've got a lot of institutions, and sometimes it's very hard to show which concrete possibilities have all the institutions.
Yeah, exactly. This is certainly one of the points. If we go back to the famous, you cannot do a lecture on European foreign policy without quoting Kissinger's famous quote on the telephone number. But clearly, there's always the problem of understanding who does the work, right? And also, as we are going to see today together, with the new institutional structure set up by the Lisbon Treaty, we still wonder who is doing what. Another far more pragmatic reason. Some of you, even if your topic is not immediately related to the institutional setup, will need to make research in the real world. Well, that's the real world. A very tiny little piece of it, but always try to remember that behind institutions, there are people that determine the capacity to act in the real world. So even if this is not directly related to your research topic, try to have a grasp of who does what and how is perceived by the world that surrounds him or her, and how he manages or she manages to navigate such world. If we translate this slide into a theoretically relevant question, this sort of crowded slides, even if we would have taken over the previous and current, would have been a quite crowded picture, right? Bring us back to a theoretical question. That is the very beginning of our class. Who acts when we talk about the European Union, right? In general, and this is something I was mentioning already before, we have the literature studying of European studies have distinguished, in order to make sense of the ability to act of the European Union in the international system, between these two terms, presence and actorness. What do you know what they are about? What is the distinction between presence and actorness? Yes.
Can you ask
Yes.
It's the difference between who can act, who can make the politics on reality, and at the same time, who can just manage that in documents according to...
In a way, but in this case, this real definition means something else, right? It relates more to the weight that any actor can pull in the international scene. There is a sort of reflex light, right, in the way in which we perceive international actors. Meaning, by its only existence, we attribute to certain actors certain characteristic. With this, when we allude to this concept, to this ability, right, to make the difference in the international scene, we refer to the word presence. So, for instance, we know when we say, for instance, the EU, we say an international organization of a special kind that brought peace where there was war. And even if someone doesn't understand or doesn't have a grasp of the complexity that we are discussing here together, people in the street, when hear EU, yes, they hear bureaucracy, mess, and whatever, but still associate it with an idea, right, of an actor of a different kind. An actor which is not only one state or a federal state composed by different, let us say, federate states, but different sovereign states that pool their sovereignty together in order to act domestically and internationally, right? When we talk about, for instance, the presence of the European Union for a long time, we may say that actually the European Union was associated with the concept of normative power, something that many analysts said, yes, but a little bit also beyond the way in which it acts, the actorness, right? Precisely because presence, in a world dominated by image, right, and in a world in which battles are never only material but also semantic over the sense we attribute, the meaning we attribute to things, right, the presence of any international actor still holds an important weight in determining the perceptions of such actor in the international scenes, right? Actorness is clearly related not all to how a given actor looks or is perceived, but also to his capability to act, right? And we have already made the point that another important seminal work in European Union studies mentioned, when we talk about actorness of the European Union, to the problem of the capability expectation gap. That the presence engineers a lot of expectations on what the European Union can effectively do in the international system, but then and yet the actorness, its ability to act, always leaves us sort of disappointed, right? These two things explain agency at the international level, right? After all, when we talk about agency, and going back to the previous slides that we have seen together, we talk about individuals taking decisions and implementing them on behalf of entities which possess varying degrees of coherence, organization, and power, right? Clearly, if we go back to the previous slides, we immediately see that there are challenges connected to the ability of acting at the international level for the European Union that reflects the soap opera that we reviewed before. Yes, it was a little bit a soap opera moment to break the ice, but not only that, because also the individuals that are selected for given positions explain the level of ambitions underpinning certain choices, but also their ability to concretely steer their own organizations. Here we are talking always of the tip of the iceberg. When we talk about these institutions, we are talking about huge bureaucracies, that need to have direction. Then clearly the system of decision-making, right? How the decision-making needs to be engineered in order to produce decisions. Question of implementation, as we are going to see, and eventually the question of coherence. Always bear in mind that the EU, despite all the name that we attributed to it, is not a federal state like the US, which imposes its foreign policy decision over 50 states. Doesn't have this ability. From this point of view, we will see, and we may also discuss from the comparative federal perspective, right? What sort of federation is the EU, or incomplete federation is the EU? But when we talk about foreign policy, the system, let's say the pyramid, is reversed in the sense that the member states hold the bulk of their sovereign powers, okay? Therefore, it's exactly the opposite model that we see when we look at the US, whereby clearly this is the federal competence for antonomasia. Going back to the institutional actors, again and in a nutshell, when we talk about foreign policy, so far so good? Yeah? We have the European Council and its new president, the Council of the European Union, as we mentioned, or the Council of Ministers, the presidency of the Council of the European Union and the trio, which means yet another line of leadership, the High Representative, the EEAS, and the delegations on the ground, the European Commission, and we still should not neglect the fact that despite in a reduced format, also the European Parliament and the European Court of Justice have some sort of role. In this lecture, in what follows, I will above all talk about the executive actors, but just let me spend a word about these two other institutions of the European Union. The European Parliament has a lot of ambition, but a very limited roles in foreign policy, above all if we think about its decision-making processes. We'll go back to this question in the sense the European Parliament doesn't take part to the decision-making process in the matter of CFSP, which is Common Foreign and Security Policy, right? Despite this, the European Parliament is very active when it comes to foreign policy dossiers. First of all, it holds a lot of committees that do the job. The Committee of Foreign Affairs, on Security and Defense. So they are parliamentary committees that work and do actively research in order to contribute to the debate on how to act and how to tackle global crisis. On top of that, the European Parliament still holds budget powers that determine somehow the decisions. It manages to sort of flex the muscles with all the possibility that it tried to find in order to influence the debate on foreign policy, right? Plus, it holds several interparliamentary committees with which he does his own diplomacy with third-party states. Clearly, its activism also has meant in the past that he has constantly took the flag of accountability to ask the EEAS and the High Representative to report, to come to the Parliament and report, to inform the Parliament, to exchange information in order exactly to make these decisions or these mainly executive machinery more accountable to the people of the European Union, okay? The European Court of Justice, we know, that basically hold a very important role as in terms of quasi-general jurisdiction on the legitimacy of the act of the European Union. Well, in this case, the European foreign policy, CFSP, is in derogation. the European Court of Justice holds virtually no power, but two important exceptions. First of all, it looks whether competencies in matters of common foreign security policy impinge or affect competencies in all other areas of policy making, so whether there is a breach or a derogation to this principle. And second point, it does have a word and it does control the legitimacies when it comes to the decision of imposing sanctions, financial or commercial sanctions, to physical or legal persons. So these are the two derogations, and in the past the European Court of Justice did use it and did sort of flex the muscles. For the rest, it's good to bear in mind that with this caveat in mind, we talk about a mainly executive machinery to deal with foreign policy. Going back, and just to have a visualization, we will have more than one, and this I'm going just to let you glance. We talk about this mess. We have got here the Council. Think about a triangle. This is the only one organization, the Council of Ministers. As you know, the Council of Ministers, it's, let us say, a misnomer, because we should talk about councils of ministers. There are several formations. All the formations, we have got 2 years, and this is a novelty of the Treaty of Lisbon, right? Here we have all the various bodies of the committee, of the Council. We will go back to that, would intervene in the making of decisions at the European Union level, at the Council level. Starting from the bottom of the pyramid, we will see some graphic on that as well, where we have got basically diplomats for the permanent representations of the European Union member states, working basically on a daily basis, depending on the dossiers, in order to pave the ground for decision taken at the highest level, right? Then on top we have the European Council. Here we missed the Commission for a reason that we'll discuss later. Here we got the new sort of institutional leadership that comes closer to the organization of the Council in a way or in the next. Bear with me because I will talk about it later. And here we have got the rotating presidency. So as you can see, and once again, it's not only a matter of remembering names, but also a matter of remembering that beyond the names of the holders of a given office, we really have a sort of labyrinth of different organizations that interact closely with each other in order to come up with a given output when it comes to foreign policy. Right. What is foreign? Yes, please. Absolutely, but can I wait for that? Because I mean, I'm going to look at the institutions one by one. I wanted you to just get closer, yeah? We will discuss in a second. Can I ask you what is foreign policy? If you should define what is foreign policy, we have just started with a very landscape view, by a far, of how the European Union is organized. We're very far, and the question that you have made clearly revealed that, for talking about how the institutions work and operate, right? But let's go back to the question, why do the institutions work to produce what sort of output? How would you define foreign policy? Haha, yeah, exactly, I know. That's not easy. Yes?
I see it like a whole complete mechanism developed by an entity in order to promote its objectives and interests outside that entity.
Very good definition.
Well, I think it's like a comprehensive program that is structured by a state to, as he mentioned, to achieve its objectives. So it's money from one entity to another, which is different from our own national officials.
Very good point. Shall we see? Anyone want to add anything about that? Because these definitions were deliberately broad, which makes sense, huh? Let's see one definition. a goal or problem-oriented program by authoritative policymakers directed towards entities outside the policymakers' political jurisdiction. The sum of official external relations conducted by an independent actor, usually a state, in international relations. How do these definitions differ from each other? And what does they tell us of our puzzle or conundrum when we deal with foreign policy? Because I mean, let's be completely honest. It's easy to shoot at the Red Cross, as we say in Italian, to see the European Union, it's a mess. But then, when we start to see the moving target of foreign policy, we can actually imagine that the walls of ministries at the national level can create quite some problem, can't they? What is today a problem or a program that needs to be authoritatively pursued? Here it's evident that in the 90s, Herman was clearly imagining that we were talking about states, that's it. Here, after 10 years, Hill is using at least a nuance, of meaning to foresee the actions of and possibility to act above and below the states, meaning that foreign policy is not any longer confined to the sort of a realm of statehood, What is the problem with this definition? I mean, if you were today the foreign ministry of your ideal state, how would you set up your organizational machinery? What is the problem? Where are the problems?
Because foreign policy, if you can tell it like this, the European Union is a policy of sui generis, and there is a problem that states don't want to give sovereignty in foreign policy, which is one of the signs of a sovereign state. They don't want to give a sovereignty to the European Union because it's one of the signs of the state, as I said, and it's very hard for them because all the states have different
priorities,
and it's very hard to coordinate the same aim in all the states.
Oh, that's for sure. But even if we forget for a second that we are talking about EU foreign policy, and we would say, okay, let's assume that we have got a state. We are head of states. We are foreign ministry. How do I set up my foreign policy?
Are you asking about the problem
Yeah.
of the definition? I think one problem would it be like a problem oriented, because I guess that foreign policy might not be related with the problem. It might be just a comprehensive, a huge, entire program that you manage in foreign policy by. So you shouldn't have a problem existing to have a proper foreign policy. And when it comes to the EU, it's a problem when you're talking about an independent actor, because we do not have a specific actor that manages the foreign policy of the EU, so we cannot define exactly what is the actor in the European Union who manages foreign policy.
Well, we can, but clearly here you have the two things, the dialogues before you mention at the international level. And so, if we have got a spilling into our territorial waters, of oil spilling in our territorial waters, do you have a foreign policy problem or not? Yes? Can I just... Sorry.
Foreign policy depends on several factors, either internally or externally, and according to those factors, we can try to achieve our goal.
Exactly, but all these questions dialogue with each other. We have a problem that is not only related to the question that Caterina was voicing, which obviously it's the typical, it's the elephant in the room, that clearly we have a problem in understanding when the borders of our foreign, domestic, the borders between domestic and foreign, where does it start? Right? And if I really need to organize an institutional machinery accordingly, what sort of interinstitutional bodies do I need to come up with in order to deal with this problem. Let us say environment. Here, by definition, couldn't care less of the borders, territorial or political, that we define as poor human beings. It goes through. We have got a problem with territorial waters. It's immediately a problem with waters. That's it, full stop, new paragraph. We have got a problem of air pollution. We have got a problem that invests all a region, an entire region, if not higher. So basically, and already we are talking about environment, which is not exactly the nitty-gritty of what you study in order to become a diplomat, is it? So we have got problems already at the national level to understand how to embed different expertise, right, in the process of policy making, because expertise is power. Expertise is the bulk of the reaction of a given actor, yeah? And we have got a problem that stems from that. How do we organize it, right? It's easier when you have got a centralized executive. If we look at the European Union clearly, you wouldn't exactly say we have such things when it comes to foreign policy, but it's already challenging when it comes to the analysis of states. Let alone that, as this second definition highlights, that also non-authoritative policymaking managed to come up with foreign policy activities that influence the overall global environment. So clearly, we have a situation whereby talking of foreign policy equates to walk into a minefield if we are about thinking how to design perfect institutions to deal with problems. It's 10, I can carry on, right? You are not dying, you are not, it's all okay. If you at a certain point just start gasping, you just, yes?
I just wanted to add that I think it's a big problem of global governance in the sense that, of course, when you have to design a foreign policy, you have to take into account as well the different actors, that it's not just the state.
There we go.
It's not the organization itself. You have to deal with private actors, for instance, in the sense authorities, different entities that
there we go.
contribute to shape the foreign policy that the state has to take.
There we go. That's an amazing point. And also, if you think we go back to these questions for any and each policy sectors have got answers clearly. Just to make a point, just to dialogue with what she's saying, and above all giving you examples. Think about sanctions, right? This awareness brought us about talking about sanctions, economic, financial, commercial, and so forth, and then smart sanction. The idea that the state is a black box and then you target the state for having a perfect solution has been dismissed. No international organization from the UN to the EU and so forth, to state that themselves, would target an entire state, right? Just because there is a foreign policy problem. Now, when we talk about smart sanction, that is exactly the awareness of the attempt to deal with that awareness, right? So basically today, many times, and if you check and Google, right, sanctions from the Council and so forth against Russia and so forth, okay, it's against Russia, but actually boils down to name of persons in specific positions in the states, to given oil actors and companies, precisely because of what you said. There is so many different actors that designing a foreign policy means a level of intel that clearly spans across what we define as policy field. One is not any longer enough. You may be the finest foreign policy actorness, but if you do not know who are the, I don't know, the energy giant in a given place, well, you are not finding a solution, are you, right? If you can be really a fine connoisseur of the history of a given country, but if you don't know who are the oligarchs militating in a direction or in another in that countries, you run the risk of turning a noble intention, right, into a failure, just because you sort of tackled the problems by forgetting the point that you were highlighting. Okay. So if this is foreign policy, what is EU foreign policy? Caterina just already said it, but if you want to add anything else, we do have got a foreign policy, because the point is always understanding of what kind, right? Because we do have a foreign policy at the European level. But clearly, going back to the question, if it is challenging at the national level, it's going to be simply more challenging when it comes to the international level. In general, EU foreign policy is seen as a part of a political system. The funny thing is that 20 years ago, still stand. Those are the typical things where change happens a little bit slowly, yeah, for the reason that Caterina was saying. It was 1966 when Stanley Hoffman called European foreign policy the heart of the artichoke. Meaning, okay, you go and you integrate the European Union, but you cannot just like take leaf by leaf and glob leaf by leaf competencies, because at a certain point you will arrive closer to the heart of the artichoke, that are the sensitivities, the identities for how password this word is, right? When we talk about identity, what do we mean? But yet, when we talk about foreign policy, the fact that there is still this sort of tendency to protect the heart of the article is that this doesn't prevent to see that it's a foreign policy of a different kind. It is, in other terms, a foreign policies that allow different actors to pursue partly common, partly separated international actions, provided that they somehow operate in a spirit of mutual solidarity and do not undermine the coherence of the European Union as a whole, right? In the previous slides, we can see, yes, that there is an additional form of difficulty, but we can also see that some of the problem that foreign policy rises to policymakers and to practitioners, let alone analysts, applies to the two levels, the state level, right, and the European Union level. Just before moving forward, what is diplomacy? If this is the definition of foreign policy, how would we define diplomacy? Is it about executive decisions, diplomacy? No. Exactly. In general, it's not. There is a relations of functionality, right? When we talk about diplomacy for a long time, again, super old definition, we will see how it changes, right? We have the questions on defining diplomacy in terms of a function of foreign policy. In other terms, executive actors take decisions in the framework of foreign policy activities, and the diplomats execute, interact, negotiate, translate, technically, let us say, these questions at the international level. Now, is it only about sitting in a room with other diplomats, discussing about international problem and negotiating? What is diplomacy today?
I just wanted to say that it's quite hard talking about EU diplomacy because we are talking that Federica Mogherini is a boss of European Union diplomacy. But before you were talking about the phone number of European Union, but in the means of European diplomacy, for example, if you want to talk with Russia, with the United States, probably they will not go to both of European.
Above all in this moment, absolutely. I wouldn't dare to say that immediately they would call Federica Mogherini, either Putin or Trump. But they perhaps wouldn't take the phone at all right now as well. Yeah, the problem with the EU, it's still there. But I mean, it's only, and you mentioned before, okay, we have the boss. Okay, the boss, we have already said the boss, but there is no single boss because we have a machinery that allows several actors to pull their weight based on their competencies, right? Federica Mogherini is doing her work, and honestly, I must say that is not doing her work that badly right now, and is trying to push her office within the remit of her possibility. So it's not, right now, it's not, even if you look at policy analysts and commentaries, she is not exactly the target of criticism because clearly her action still reflect, right, the level of ambition, yeah, of the letter of the treaties, but she has been pushing. But going back to my question, we will go back to European diplomacy. Going back to my question, is diplomacy only about speaking among diplomats in a room?
It's about expressing the wishes, values of the party that we are representing, and sometimes even negotiating certain things.
There we go. This is an important point that you are making there, because I mean, today, for instance, we talk about diplomacy, but it's even more important to talk about public diplomacy. Which means, and once again, going back to the point that was raised before, that is not any longer a governmental business. When we talk about any of these activities, you cannot possibly imagine that any act of foreign policy, let alone diplomacy, exclude the ability to reaching out below and above the level of the state executive, right? So public diplomacy is exactly about that. Indeed, it's a very interesting field of study. It's actually my field of study right now, which I love, precisely because the border between this form of representation and propaganda can get blurred, and actors plays around and jiggles around those borders with a sort of degree of freedom. They take their own room of maneuver in order to express their values and so forth, yeah? In order to represent, in order to captivate somehow foreign audience. But clearly, on top of the challenges of foreign policy, we have the challenge of diplomacy, which more and more is becoming a PR act, an act whereby you need to master the semantic and not only the material field in order to win support of your action. So the European Union, coming, yes. Yes.
Public diplomacy is internal way, not external?
It's both way, as usual. It's a very good question. The question of who is the object of public diplomacy is very interesting. Because public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, science diplomacy, we have got a plethora of so-called new modes of diplomacy. It's always a speech that cuts both ways. You are telling to your people your own stories in ways that are always partial if you think about it, right? You tell your own stories. If you are applying for a job, you're certainly not telling to your wannabe boss, oh yeah, I like a lot sleeping in the morning till late. I like drinking a lot, or things that you say. I'm very responsible, hard worker person, same with states. I mean, what do we expect them to tell them? The sort of dirty dish? No, they don't. But going back to your point, both culture and public diplomacy actually, specifically in these fields, always communicate both ways.
When you use propaganda?
Yeah. Propaganda, clearly, we cannot immediately associate. There are clearly studies of propaganda and study of all these, let us say, if you think about it, cognate sort of fields have got different ways of studying. Certainly, we establish what is the difference between propaganda and diplomacy is never telling a neutral story. But that's not the issue of today's class. Let's not open that box right now. But clearly, it's always a sensitive political issue. But once again, the problem that you were highlighting, and your name is Selma. How could I forget Selma? The problem that Selma is highlighting, it's key. Clearly, yeah, you want to influence foreign policy decision and the public, but you are constantly in dialogue with your own constituency. Think about right now, the European Union is making enormous effort in order to craft a sound public diplomacy. Because for a long time, it was comfortably living in the shadow of this normative power Europe, right? The fact that our coherence and our standards domestically are the one that we want to promote internationally. Right now that the European building is so much under the pressures of several crises, the European Union and the European, as we will see in the exercise that we're going to do in a second, is trying hard to come up with a new strategy. Does this strategy, public diplomacy strategy, let alone a strategy for action? Because it's, yes, in parallel, a strategy of public diplomacy and a strategy on how to design its own priorities of action in foreign policy, right? And yet, clearly, we see that these sort of arguments are also targeting domestic audiences, meaning the constituencies of the member states. It's constantly, as it has to do with the word, it's the word of power, diplomacy, as always several objectives in parallel. Defining the objective is always quite tricky when it comes to self-representation.